Ladies and gentlemen, this will be the final video here before I do the live stream, which is going to happen tonight. I want to go live sometime around 5 o'clock Eastern, and I will be going all the way through until we have a winner, which I'm very confident we will have a winner tonight, hopefully by around 1:30 to 2 Eastern. Either way, both Harris and Trump will be speaking, I'm sure, and addressing their supporters sometime tonight. At what time, it just depends on when the election gets called, depending on whenever that might be. But either way, guys, I did want to talk about what can we expect when it comes to states that are going to get called first. What are we going to look for? Things like that when it comes to tonight, because obviously when votes come in, you're going to see maybe a liberal state come in conservative, and then people are going to get excited. But some of these states, you need to expect it based on the way they count the votes. So when it comes to the polls closing, you can see this is just New York Times. Some polls closed, all polls closed, and then you can see it says polls closed earlier. So you can see the first at 6 o'clock, there will be some polls closing in Indiana and also Kentucky. That's why they're able to call Indiana so early. I don't think they actually call states until all the polls close. So that would be them calling Indiana and Kentucky right at 7 o'clock, which is normally when they do start calling states. And then you'd also look for them to potentially call Vermont. You're also going to get some of the polls closing in New Hampshire, which is an interesting state to follow as well. Virginia, all polls close at 7 o'clock, and that will come in red, we would expect. It came in red immediately in 2016 and 2020. It was red for a while in 2016. A lot of people thought Trump was going to flip it against Hillary. Hillary came back at the way end and won it by a point. In 2020, it came in red early, and then Biden very easily won it. I think they called it immediately, Virginia. That'll be interesting to watch at 7 o'clock. I don't think they're going to call it immediately, but I do think there might be some conservatives that get a little bit over happy when it comes to just the way they count the votes in Virginia, because there's been this narrative that Virginia is going to flip, and it's probably going to come in early and what I mean by that is like 20% reported, 30% reported, Trump's up by 5-10 points, whatever it is with the rural areas, and then they dump the Fairfax, and then liberals overtake with like 55-60% in. Maybe Trump will keep the lead throughout the entire counting of it, but Virginia, that's an early state we're going to be watching as well. Obviously, Georgia is extremely important. Normally, as far as I know with Georgia, they normally stagger it. Like, you're not going to see the early vote come in first with Harris up, or with, that's not how it's going to work. It's going to be, and overall, the early vote is very close in Georgia anyway, so it really doesn't matter. You're not going to see someone, like, ideally, we would want Trump to just be up continuously in Georgia by like 4 or 5 points, although it just depends. You get the Atlanta votes first, you're going to get a liberal lead. It depends the way they get counted. South Carolina obviously will be a Trump state. We would imagine they would call that right when it closes or shortly after, you would expect. And then Florida, a lot of people are talking about Florida, Republicans saying it's looking like a bloodbath there, possibly a 10, 11, 12-point victory. But we do now realize, and a lot of people are saying this, that Florida is not really indicative of some of the Rust Belt states and the other swing states like it was in 2016 or 2020. It's kind of branched off, just like Ohio. You could say, well, Ohio is right next to Pennsylvania. If Ohio goes to Trump by 8 points, it's really good. It's just not. There's certain states that have become more Republican and certain states that have become more liberal, and they've branched off from other states, and that's what Florida's done. They become more Republican. So it's not this crazy indicator if Trump wins it by 10 or 11 points, but we know Florida, people are wondering, will they call it right away? I don't know. It's going to be interesting. They're not going to call it at 7 o'clock because that's just some of the polls close. And then at 7:30, you can see the polls in Ohio close. So when it comes to Ohio, it's going to come in blue, and then we'll see when it switches. But normally with about 50% of the vote in, it'll switch to Trump. But I would expect it to come in blue just based on the way they count those votes in Ohio. The hope with Ohio is Trump is able to switch it with like 40% in and maybe win Ohio by 10 or 11 points. But Ohio will start blue when the votes get counted at 7:30. People are going to get worried. That's just how it is. North Carolina, that's another huge state. We'll see how the counting goes in North Carolina, but normally that's a back and forth. And Trump's been able to hold on to a lead throughout basically the entirety of the counting in North Carolina in 2016 and 2020. And it's going to be very, very close again in 2024. That's North Carolina getting closing their polls at 7:30. When you're talking about 8 o'clock, you get Illinois, which will be a liberal state. It might be a little bit closer, but it's going to go to Harris, and they're going to call it right away. Oklahoma, they'll call it right away. Alabama, they'll call it right away. Mississippi, they'll call it right away. Tennessee, they'll call it right away. These are the SEC states. Florida will probably get called sometime around 8:39, I would imagine, because they count their votes really early. DC will get called. Maine, it'll be interesting to see some of those votes that come in. It kind of gets overshadowed, though, with all these polls closing. But these are a lot of states that you would expect, would go one. Missouri is going to go to Trump. And then you've got North and South Dakota, obviously both Trump states, some of the polls closing there. You've got Kansas. It'll be interesting to see the margin there. And you've got some of the polls closing in Texas. That's at 8 o'clock. Texas, it's looking pretty good for Trump to potentially get around a 7 or an 8-point win, which is something I didn't think was going to happen. But based off of how Trump is closed in terms of the polls there, it is looking good. And then obviously at 8 o'clock, you're still going to be counting all of the important votes. When you're talking about a North Carolina, you're talking about a Georgia, Pennsylvania. That's going to be the big one at 8 o'clock. The polls closing in Pennsylvania. Now, I do want to talk about Pennsylvania and just the Rust Belt as a whole. What we see with Pennsylvania, I think this is all three of the Rust Belt states. It's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Trump will very likely, because of how they count the day of vote versus the early vote, Trump should take a lead. Now, the idea is Trump is going to be able to keep his lead in Pennsylvania. Let me explain the dynamic of what's going to be happening in Pennsylvania. As long as it's the same protocols as 2016 and 2020, Trump will take a lead, and then they're going to do all the early vote, and that's when Harris is going to try and catch up. Because Democrats do have around a 400K advantage in terms of early vote. 2020, it was 1.1 million. It's been slashed. Dems are hoping they get more day of voting, but Trump will have more day of voting, undoubtedly, not even close in Pennsylvania. Trump's going to build a nice lead. That's what we saw, remember, in 2020 when Trump had like a 16-point lead with 54% of the vote in. The question is, will Dems, have they built a big enough firewall like they were always talking about to where they can make up that day of vote lead that Trump's going to have? And it's going to be like that, I believe, in all of the Rust Belt states. So Trump should start out in front. And the question is, because we saw it in 2016 where Trump started off up by a ton against Hillary. Hillary tried bringing it back. It got close, but Trump still hung on to win all three of those states. Can Trump hang on in all of those states? This is where it maybe becomes stress-free if you're Trump and you build up this lead. It's also important. Liberals, I think, are going to get overconfident by saying, oh, the day of vote is not that big of a blowout. We're going to bring this back. They don't have the early votes to bring it back like a crazy comeback like they did in 2020. So they might do better early on in the night in Pennsylvania because they're going to get more day of votes, but they don't have the ammunition in terms of the votes to bring back the margin like they did in 2020. So that's the dynamic. It's going to be closer when it comes to day of. Trump's still going to be in the lead, but then they're not going to have that extra ammunition once they dump all the early votes into the equation in these Rust Belt states. And so that's the dynamic. They need to keep it really close or relatively close. And if Trump is able to build up a massive lead in Pennsylvania, you could be looking at a very nice chance of him winning that state. So Pennsylvania closes. Some of the polls in Michigan close. Wisconsin does not close until 9 o'clock. You can see at 8:30, Arkansas closes. That'll be called for Trump. At 9 o'clock, you've got all these states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. The 2nd district is something people will be watching. I don't think it's really that important. Harris is going to win it. Kansas, you've got Texas fully closing. We would imagine normally they wait to call Texas at least a little bit, but we'll see. Arizona closing. That'll be Arizona closes pretty early when you're talking about where it's located. But Arizona closes, and people are already talking about how annoying that's going to be to count. This is the thing I'll say about Arizona. Trump might be able to win Arizona by about 4 or 5 points. If that's the case, even with the Maricopa County, the issues, you could call it for Trump with like 85, 86% of the vote. And you don't need, the problem is in 2020, it was a 0.3 margin. It was very, very close. So basically you had to count every single vote to decide a winner. Once you get to a certain point where it becomes impossible, you can call it for Trump, and that's the hope with Arizona, where Trump wins it by 4 or 5 points and it becomes easier to call. If you're wondering, New York, they close at 9 o'clock, so definitely later. And when it comes to New York, it's going to go to Harris. I would hope the margin would be closer, but we'll just have to see the way they get counted. If they start counting, New York City, it's going to be a big comeback for Trump, obviously, to get that closer, but it just depends. And then you've got the 10 o'clock time. You've got Montana closing. You're going to be looking for Sheehy to win that one. I think Trump's going to win Montana by around 20 points. Utah is going to go to Trump immediately. They're going to call it. Nevada, obviously, we're going to be waiting on Arizona, Nevada late in the night. The hope is that as long as things are going well in the Rust Belt, Georgia, North Carolina, some of those states start getting called right around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. It would be mainly Georgia, North Carolina, and then you'd be looking at Pennsylvania and the other 2 Rust Belt states, I would imagine, in terms of when they would get called. And then you would, be looking at a Nevada and an Arizona. And there was some good early data that came in for liberals, and that swung Nevada a little bit in terms of the betting within the past few hours. And then at 11 o'clock, you've got Washington, Oregon, California. They're all going to go left. Idaho's going to go right pretty much immediately. And then you have Hawaii closing at midnight and Alaska officially closing at 1 a.m. And I would imagine at that point, at 1 a.m., we should have a pretty good perspective on where everything is. I don't think this is going to be like 2020 where we're in the dark and everything like that, and there's all this vote, outstanding. I would imagine we should have a pretty good idea, and then possibly by around 1:30, 1:45, we're going to start hearing rumblings. we're going to know kind of where the situation is going. And then there's going to be a lag where they make sure, and then someone's going to come out and they're going to call it, whether it's the AP, whether it's whoever it ends up being. And then that's when Trump and Harris will have to come out and speak at around 2 a.m. That's what I would imagine would happen. That's just my prediction. But, obviously the things we're looking at, it's Georgia. It's 7 o'clock. That's going to be the big drop. It's also Virginia. Both of those polls close. We'll see what happens with New Hampshire. But I don't think all the polls close in New Hampshire right away at 7 o'clock. Those are going to be the states to look at. It's Georgia, North Carolina early on. Then you get Pennsylvania. Then you get the other 2 Rust Belt states. You get Arizona and you get Nevada. That's kind of how it's going to go. Ideally, you get Georgia, North Carolina. Those states start looking good. Then you get a Pennsylvania. Trump's going to have the lead in Pennsylvania. It's just the way they count in these states. Like Trump's going to be trailing in Ohio. It's perfectly fine. That's just the way it is. And then he'll go ahead with like 40 or 50%. And Trump's going to be winning in Virginia. And then we'll see if he's able to maintain it. But it's just the way the states count votes. So either way, guys, we will have to see what ends up happening when it comes to this election cycle. But that's going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.